Okay, let's cut straight to the chase. That figure you always hear, 50% of marriages end in divorce. Is that really the whole story?
It's the number everyone quotes, isn't it? But yeah, today we're digging into whether it holds up.
Exactly. We're doing a deep dive into marriage and divorce in America. We've got a bunch of sources, and we're going to try and unpack the complexities, get the real numbers behind the headlines.
It's a really good place to start questioning that figure because, well, as we'll see, the picture is way more intricate. It really depends on how you measure it.
Totally. And for you listening, if you want to get smart on this without drowning in stats, we'll keep it clear, keep it engaging. We're even going to hit that specific question about repeat marriages, the denominator effect, right? How that might skew things.
Yeah, how those serial spouses might be bumping up the numbers you hear.
So let's jump in.
Thinking bigger picture, it's not just about debunking a myth. It's about understanding something fundamental, isn't it? How we build, keep, and sometimes, well, end these really close relationships.
Couldn't agree more. So over this deep dive, we'll look at all the different ways divorce is even counted. Because it's definitely not just one number.
No, not at all.
We'll get into the impact of multiple marriages, take a walk through history, see how the laws have changed.
Which is fascinating how society's view shifts over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the legal side, too. What actually happens when a marriage ends.
And what societal changes push those legal shifts. That history is key to understanding now.
Definitely. We'll also dig into socioeconomic factors, surprising links there. Infidelity, obviously. Widowhood, often overlooked.
Yeah, the impact of losing a spouse, not just through divorce.
How kids are affected, and even international marriages. The whole goal is to pull out the important stuff, leave you feeling informed, but, not overwhelmed. Ready.
Let's do it. It's kind of wild how many ways we try to measure something so personal, like a marriage ending.
You got it. So that 50% divorce rate, like we said, not so simple. There isn't just one rate. Several ways to slice it.
Right.
First, you've got the crude divorce rate. That's divorces per 1,000 people. Total population.
Uh-huh. Like everyone.
Yeah. In 2022, it was around 2.4. But the catch is obvious, right? Includes unmarried folks, kids, everyone.
Exactly. So it gives you a general population sense, but not really the risk for married people specifically. That's where the refined divorce rate is better.
Okay, refined. How's that work?
That one looks at divorces per 1,000 married women aged 15 plus. So it's focused on the groom actually, eligible for divorce.
Makes sense. What's that number like?
In 2023, it was about 14.4 per thousand, down just a tiny bit from 14.6 in 2022. Generally seen as more precise for tracking risk within the married population.
Okay, much clearer. Then there's the divorce-to-marriage ratio.
Mm-hmm.
This is one that compares divorces in a year to marriages in the same year.
Yes, the one divorce for every 2 marriages kind of headline.
Exactly, but it can be really misleading, can it?
Totally, because the people getting divorced in, say, 2023 aren't the same people who got married in 2023. You're comparing different groups entirely. It's not a probability for a new marriage.
Right, not the same cohort. Which brings us to, well, cohort-specific rates. Lifetime risk.
Now, this is where you get the best sense of long-term probability for a group.
How does that work?
You track a cohort who all got married around the same time, follow them over years, decades even, see what percentage eventually divorce.
Gotcha. Any examples?
Yeah, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the one started in '79, they found about 46% of those who married in that group had divorced by age 55.
Wow, okay. Close to 50%.
Close, yeah. And experts like Paul Amato, looking at more recent trends, project the lifetime risk is likely somewhere between 42 and 45% now.
So cohort studies give a cleaner picture of actual long-term stability for a generation. Avoids the snapshot issues.
Precisely. And then there's one more, percentage ever divorced.
Which is just what it sounds like.
Pretty much. Just the share of adults who've ever been married and have gone through at least one divorce. Back in 2016, census data had it around 34% for women, 33% for men, aged 20 plus.
So a big chunk of the population has experienced it, but it's cumulative, right, over their whole lives.
Exactly. It counts the people, not the divorce events. Which leads right back to your question about that denominator effect and serial spouses.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that. The idea that people marrying and divorcing multiple times might be skewing the numbers.
It definitely plays a role. Because the divorce rate isn't the same for every marriage.
Right. You said it's higher for later marriages.
Significantly higher. First marriages, the risk is around that 40-41% mark we talked about. But second marriages, that jumps up to maybe 60-67%.
Right.
And third marriages, even higher. We're talking 70-73% risk.
Yikes. So that general 40-50% figure really does bundle everything together.
It does. One source specifically mentioned it includes those who engage in serial marriages, marrying 5, 6, 7 or more times.
So one person can contribute multiple divorces to the yearly count.
Exactly. Think about it. Someone divorces 3 times. That's 3 divorce events hitting the annual stats, even though it's just one person's marital history.
Is there data on how common multiple marriages are?
Yeah, 2016 census data showed most had only married once, about half of ever married adults. But a decent chunk married more than once. Around 12-13% married twice, and another 3-4% married 3 or more times. And that NLSY 79 study, by age 55, 60% had married just once. But 22% had married twice, and 6% 3 or more times. The average was 1.2 marriages for people in that group.
Okay, so how does this serial spouse thing affect the different rates we talked about?
Well, the crude rate and the divorce-to-marriage ratio are most affected, because they just count total divorce events each year. More divorces from repeat marriers inflate that number.
Right, it makes the pool look bigger.
The refined rate is a bit less affected because it focuses on currently married women, and cohort studies looking only at first marriages, they're the least impacted by definition.
And the percentage ever divorced just counts people, not how many times.
Exactly. One person, one count, regardless of 2 or 3 divorces.
So that whole 50% of marriages end in divorce line? It's really more like a lifetime probability guess for all marriages lumped together, maybe reflecting older groups or including separations.
That seems closer, yeah. Or maybe it's anchored to those cohort findings, like the NLSY 79's 46% by age 55, or Amato's 42-45% projection.
But the key takeaway is, it doesn't mean half of current marriages are doomed soon, and it's definitely not the risk for every single first marriage.
Absolutely not. Things like your education level, how old you are when you get married,
Right.
those make a huge difference in the probability.
Right. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because despite that sticky 50% idea, the actual trend for divorce rates, it's mostly been downhill since the 80s peak.
It has. The crude rate, for instance, dropped from 4.0 per thousand in 2000 down to 2.4 in 2022.
That's a big drop.
It is. And the refined rate has generally trended downwards too.
So why? What's driving that?
Several factors seem to be involved. People are marrying later, for one. The median age is up 30 for men, 28 for women back in 2016.
Okay.
Fewer people are getting married overall, too. And more couples cohabit first, maybe a testing ground effect.
Could be.
And a big one, education. Higher education levels are strongly linked to lower divorce rates. College grads tend to have more stable marriages.
But you said it's not falling for everyone, right? This divorce divide.
Exactly. The drop is mainly among college-educated folks. For those with less education, the rates have been more stable or even creeping up a bit.
And what about gray divorce?
That's the other counter-trend. Divorce rates for people over 50 have actually been increasing. While overall rates fell, this older group saw a rise.
So, complex picture. Overall decline, but splits by education and a rise in later life divorce. Any recent blips post-COVID?
Yeah, there's some indication rates might have ticked up slightly or stabilized after the lows during the pandemic. The NCFMR noted a small rise in the refined rate from 2021 to 2022, still way below the peak, though.
Okay, so the stats are way more nuanced than 50%. We've got different measures, the impact of repeat marriages, falling rates overall, but with important exceptions.
It really shows you need to look deeper than the headlines. Individual choices, societal trends, economics, they all weave together.
Absolutely. So that sets the statistical stage. Now, to really get it, we need to look back, right? Let's dive into the history of marriage and divorce in America.
Yeah, the historical context is crucial. It's amazing how different things were just a few centuries back. Really puts today into perspective.
Totally. So colonial era up to the 19th century,
Yeah.
things were all over the map depending on where you were.
Very much so. New England, surprisingly, was more liberal on divorce than England itself.
Really? Why was that?
The Puritan influence, actually. They saw marriage more as a civil contract than a purely religious sacrament. So things like adultery, desertion, even impotence could be grounds for a full divorce. Massachusetts granted quite a few, relatively speaking.
Interesting. What about other colonies?
The middle colonies were more conservative. And the southern colonies, they stuck much closer to English tradition. Getting an absolute divorce in England back then was incredibly hard-needed an act of parliament.
Wow.
And since the South didn't have the church courts England used for marital issues, formal divorce was almost unheard of there. Informal separations were more the norm.
So after the Revolution, did things standardize?
Not immediately. States started giving local courts divorce powers. But for a while, state legislatures also granted divorces directly through special acts, kind of like that English parliamentary system.
Huh. And then in the 19th century, rates started climbing.
They did. The U.S. divorce rate started to rise and actually overtook European rates. And a huge factor behind this was the Married Women's Property Acts.
Ah, right. Tell us about those.
Starting in Mississippi in 1839, these laws chipped away at the old common law idea of coverture.
Coverture.
Yeah.
It's where the wife's legal identity basically vanished into the husband's.
Exactly. Her property, her earnings, all controlled by him. These new acts gave women the right to own property, control their money, make contracts. It was revolutionary.
How did that affect divorce?
It gave women economic independence, which made leaving a bad marriage actually possible in a way it hadn't been before. Texas in 1840, Massachusetts in 1855. These acts were crucial.
And the women's rights movement was involved, too.
Absolutely. People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, groups like the National Woman Suffrage Association, they saw divorce reform as essential for women's freedom.
So the 19th century really laid the groundwork, giving women more legal and economic power.
Definitely a pivotal time, setting the stage for more accessible divorce later on.
And this patchwork of state laws led to divorce mills.
Yeah. Divorce mills, divorce capitals. It's a pretty wild part of legal history. Shows what happens when laws vary so much.
So people would travel to states with easier divorce laws.
Precisely. Residency requirements, grounds for divorce, they differed wildly. Early on, places like Indiana, Utah, the Dakotas got a reputation.
Any famous ones?
Sioux Falls, South Dakota, was big in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They had a short residency rule, 90 days at first, attracted lots of wealthy folks wanting a quick split.
Wow. Did the government notice?
They did. It actually contributed to the feds compiling the first national divorce stats back in 1887, partly to figure out what was going on in places like Sioux Falls.
And then there's the most famous one.
Reno, Nevada.
The Reno Cure.
That's the one. From the early 1900s right into the 70s, Reno was the spot. Why? Super liberal laws, especially residency. They kept shortening it 6 months, then 3 months, finally just 6 weeks in 1931.
6 weeks.
Yep, the Reno Cure. An entire industry popped up. Hotels, dude ranches for waiting out the residency, lawyers specializing in quickie divorces.
That's been busy.
Hugely. The Washoe County Courthouse handled something like 30,000 divorces just in the 1930s.
This whole idea of migratory divorce really highlights the tension, doesn't it? States controlling family law versus people wanting out of bad marriages.
It absolutely does. Led to Supreme Court cases trying to sort out if one state had to recognize another state's quickie divorce decree.
What eventually ended Reno's reign.
No-fault divorce. Started in California in '69, then spread everywhere. Once you could get divorced more easily in your home state, why go to Reno?
Makes sense. Looking back, those divorce mills, while maybe a bit scandalous, they really showed a growing need for easier divorce, didn't they? Especially for women trapped in bad situations.
They really did. They provided an escape hatch that often didn't exist elsewhere.
So the 20th century brought even bigger changes.
For sure. Things like world wars, economic depressions, they always impact families, marriage, divorce. But legally, the absolute game changer was no-fault divorce.
California, 1969, Reagan signed it.
Yep. Introduced irreconcilable differences. No need to prove fault, adultery, cruelty, whatever. Just, it's not working anymore.
And that spread fast.
Like wildfire. By 2010, every state had some form of no fault.
It was the goal.
Make it less ugly, less of a blame game, reduce conflict, lower costs, more privacy.
Did it work? Any other effects?
Well, some research suggests it might have led to fewer female suicides and less domestic violence, which is significant. As for divorce rates, maybe a short-term bump when it was first introduced in some places, but the long-term impact on overall rates seems minimal.
And it ties back to women's rights again, doesn't it?
Clearly. From those early property acts giving women some leverage, to the activism pushing for reform, to no fault finally removing that burden of proving someone was bad, it's a steady march towards more individual autonomy in ending a marriage.
Okay, so stats, history. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the legal landscape today. How does marital dissolution actually work in the courts? It's super specialized now, right?
It really is. Family law has gone from being just another thing lawyers handled or even something legislatures did to its own complex field with specialized courts. Shows how much more seriously society takes these issues now.
Right. Used to be general practitioners, maybe state legislatures, but then family courts started popping up.
Yeah, starting around the 1950s. Centralized cases, divorce, custody, support made things more consistent, hopefully more focused on the family aspect.
And it's way more than just divorce now.
Oh, absolutely. Custody, child support, dividing property, adoption, domestic violence protection, prenups. It covers the whole life cycle of family relationships, good and bad.
It's interesting that enforcing child support used to be handled almost like a criminal matter.
Yeah, those early domestic relations courts often dealt with criminal non-support. Now it's primarily a civil matter focused on the child's needs.
Okay, let's talk asset division. Huge changes there, too, especially for women.
Massive changes. Remember coverture. Under Old English common law, married women basically owned nothing legally. If a divorce somehow happened, they could be left destitute.
So those Married Women's Property Acts were critical again. Texas 1840, Massachusetts 1855, giving women the right to own property.
Absolutely essential groundwork. Fast forward to today, you basically have two main systems for dividing assets in divorce. Community property states like California, Texas, the idea there is assets and debts acquired during the marriage are owned equally, 50-50. So division is typically straightforward, splitting down the middle.
Okay, and the other system.
Equitable distribution, that's most states. Here, assets and debts are divided fairly, but that doesn't automatically mean 50-50.
So what do courts look at?
Things like how long the marriage lasted, each spouse's contributions, and importantly, that includes non-financial contributions like homemaking, their economic situation now, any separate property they had before the marriage. It's more flexible, but also more subjective.
But even with these laws aiming for fairness, is there still potential for bias? I remember reading about a study.
Yeah, the Jennifer Scheinel study from 2019, that was eye-opening. They gave legal pros hypothetical divorce cases.
Yeah.
Even when they flipped the roles, made the wife the main breadwinner and the husband the primary caregiver, there was still a tendency to award a larger share of assets to the male spouse.
Wow. So even with gender-neutral laws, subconscious biases might still be creeping in.
It suggests they might be. Which connects back to your point about lawyers historically representing the less propertied spouse, usually the wife. The law intends fairness, but biases can complicate things. And obviously, having good legal representation makes a huge difference here.
For sure. Okay, what about when kids are involved? Custody and support. What's the main principle?
Always, always, always. The best interests of the child. That's the guiding star in every state.
And how do courts figure that out? What factors?
It's a whole list. Emotional ties between parent and child, each parent's ability to provide care, health of everyone involved, any history of domestic violence.
I think so.
How the child is adjusting to home, school, community, parental willingness to support the other parent's relationship with the child. And sometimes the child's own preference, depending on age and maturity.
Are there things courts can't consider?
Yes, some states explicitly rule things out, like a parent's socioeconomic status shouldn't be the deciding factor, nor should gender, nor a parent's disability generally.
What about gender historically? Didn't courts used to favor mothers?
They did. The old tender years doctrine assumed young children were better off with their mothers. Legally, that's gone now. Laws are gender neutral. But subtle biases might linger. Some research has looked into that. And anecdotally, you still see schools often default to calling mom first.
Okay, child support. How's that calculated? Seems complicated.
There are different models states use. The most common is the income shares model, used in like 40-plus states.
How does that work?
Basically, they figure out how much the parents combined would likely spend on the child if they were still together, based on their combined income. Then they prorate that amount based on each parent's share of the combined income.
Okay, makes sense.
What else? A smaller group uses the percentage of income model. This one sets support mainly as a percentage of the non-custodial parent's income. Simpler, maybe, but less tailored.
Any others?
A few use the Melson formula. It's more complex. It considers the parent's basic needs first, then allocates support for the child, trying to ensure the child benefits from the parent's standard of living.
And what if parents live in different states? That must be a nightmare.
It can be, but there's a law called the UCCJEA, Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act. It helps sort out which state gets to make the custody decisions, preventing conflicting orders.
So the whole legal system tries to manage this difficult process, aiming for fairness and prioritizing kids.
That's the goal. It's complex, but designed to navigate these tough transitions.
Okay, so we've got the stats, the history, the legal framework. Now let's look at how divorce plays out differently across the U.S. Regionally, socioeconomically. There are clear patterns, right?
Well, definitely. Geography, income, education, they all correlate with divorce rates in pretty distinct ways. It really shows divorce isn't just personal, it's shaped by wider circumstances.
So state by state, where are rates generally higher or lower, using those crude or refined rates?
Looking at recent data, for crude rates, remember, per 1,000 total population, states like Nevada, Oklahoma, Arkansas often appear near the top.
Okay. And lowest.
Often states like Louisiana, Illinois, Massachusetts, Texas have lower crude rates.
And using the refined rate per 1,000 married women, does it look similar?
Broadly, yeah, but with some shifts. For 2023 refined rates, Delaware, North Dakota, Nevada, Oklahoma were among the highest in the contiguous U.S. Lowest included places like Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Wisconsin.
Are there clear regional trends, like the South versus the Northeast?
Generally, yes. The South tends to have higher divorce rates overall. The Northeast, generally lower. The Midwest is often low to moderate, and the West is kind of a mixed bag.
Any theories why? What makes those high divorce states different?
It often correlates with socioeconomic factors. Lower average incomes, lower education levels are common in states with higher rates. There might also be cultural differences, maybe younger average age at marriage, perhaps less stigma around divorce.
Okay, let's select socioeconomics directly. Education.
Huge correlation. It's pretty consistently inverse. The higher the level of education, the lower the risk of divorce. That overall decline in divorce we talked about, largely driven by college graduates.
And income.
Similar inverse relationship. Lower income generally correlates with higher divorce risk. More financial stress, instability, it takes a toll. Working class or poorer couples face higher risks than middle or upper income ones.
What about employment?
It's interesting. For men, consistent full-time work seems to lower divorce risk. For women, it's more complex. Some studies suggest working full-time during prime child-rearing years might correlate with slightly lower marital stability and maybe lower remarriage chances if divorced.
Urban versus rural. Any difference there?
Often, yes. Urban areas tend to have higher divorce rates than rural ones.
Why might that be?
Theories include maybe more diverse lifestyles and social mobility in cities, possibly higher stress, more economic opportunities, which can empower someone to leave but also create conflict. Maybe weaker traditional ties or less social pressure compared to tighter-knit rural communities. Census data shows more kids in rural areas live with married parents.
Cultural norms, religion, they must play a part too.
Absolutely. Cultural attitudes towards marriage and divorce vary. And religion, regular attendance at religious services is pretty consistently linked to lower divorce rates. Having no religious affiliation sometimes correlates with higher rates.
Okay, one more factor. Access to lawyers. Does that actually affect the rate itself?
It seems to. Some research suggests that when access to legal aid increases for lower-income people, the divorce rate among that eligible group goes up slightly.
So not having a lawyer is a barrier to getting divorced.
It appears so. It suggests some people might be stuck in unhappy or even unsafe marriages simply because they can't navigate the legal process or afford help. So paradoxically, a slightly higher rate in some contexts might actually reflect better access to a legal right.
Wow, so many interconnected factors. Geography, money, education, culture, even legal access shape who gets divorced and where.
It's a complex web, for sure. Far beyond just individual compatibility.
Definitely. Okay, now let's shift to a topic that always comes up with divorce.
Yeah.
Infidelity.
Ah, yes, the cheating factor. A really difficult, often central issue in marital breakdown.
How common is it really? The numbers seem all over the place.
They do vary a lot depending on how you ask and what you count as infidelity. But a general ballpark figure for lifetime prevalence within marriage is maybe around 25%.
Okay. Are there gender differences? The stereotype is men cheat more.
Historically, studies showed men reporting higher rates of sexual infidelity, yeah. Maybe 20-25% for men, 10-15% for women having extramarital sex at some point. More recent surveys, like from the Kinsey Institute or the General Social Survey, still generally show men reporting slightly higher rates, but the gap seems to be narrowing.
So Kinsey had it like 23% of men, 19% of women cheating in current relationships. GSS, maybe 20% men, 13% women admitting it ever.
Something like that. But you have to be really careful with those super high numbers. You sometimes see like 71% in one report. Those often come from non-representative online polls with very broad definitions.
Right, and the definition matters hugely, doesn't it? Emotional affairs, online stuff.
Absolutely. Women, for instance, often have a broader definition, including emotional closeness or intense non-sexual online relationships. The idea of an emotional affair is much more recognized now, and technology definitely creates new avenues.
So if men report more sexual infidelity, what about women?
Studies suggest women might be more likely to engage in emotional affairs, seeking connection they feel is missing. Men might be more likely to have affairs that are purely physical.
And the motivations. Why do people do it? Different for men and women.
Often, yes, though there's overlap. For men, common reasons cited are sexual desire, seeking variety, opportunity, maybe feeling a lack of physical intimacy at home, boosting confidence, or even avoiding other relationship problems.
And for women.
Often linked to emotional dissatisfaction, feeling unloved, neglected, ignored, seeking that emotional connection elsewhere. Sometimes revenge, boredom, or seeking personal excitement or fulfillment. One study suggested women cheating might be more attracted to the affair partner physically, but still see their husband as a better long-term bet.
Are there shared reasons?
Definitely. Poor communication, unresolved fights, simple opportunity, substance abuse issues. Those can be factors for anyone.
Any age patterns?
Older data suggested men's rates might peak later in life, maybe 70s, while women's peaked more in midlife, 50s, 60s. But some newer data hints younger women, maybe 18-29, might actually be slightly more likely to cheat now. It's complex and possibly shifting.
And that narrowing gender gap may be tied to women's increased independence.
That's a strong theory. More financial freedom, more social autonomy, maybe less reliant on marriage for status or security.
So how big an impact does infidelity have on whether a marriage survives? Is it always a deal breaker?
It's a major stressor and very often a precursor to divorce. Estimates range, but maybe 15% to 50% of divorces involve infidelity as a factor. One study found people who admitted cheating were much more likely to be divorced or separated later.
But not always the end.
No, definitely not always. Around half the people who reported having an affair were actually still married, compared to maybe 75% of those who never cheated. Interestingly, some data suggests marriages might be slightly more likely to survive if the man cheated compared to if the woman cheated.
Huh. And legally. Does it matter in court anymore? With no fault?
Usually not for dividing assets or basic custody in no-fault states, unless the affair involved wasting marital money or if the affair partner's presence negatively impacts the kids. It can sometimes affect alimony, even in no fault, and in the few fault-based states left, adultery can still be grounds and influence the outcome.
Okay, so infidelity. Common, complex motivations, big stressor, often linked to divorce but not automatically fatal for the marriage.
Pretty good summary, yeah. It's a painful reality in many relationships.
Now, we've talked a lot about divorce, but marriage ends another way too, through death. Widowhood. That's a whole different kind of ending.
It absolutely is a permanent separation, not by choice, and it brings its own profound set of financial, emotional, and social challenges. It's very common, especially for older adults, and much more common for women because of longer life expectancy.
What are the numbers like?
Back in 2016, about 14% of ever-married women over 20 had been widowed, but only 6% of men. And the gap widens dramatically with age over 75. It was like 58% of women versus 28% of men.
Wow, huge difference. Are those rates changing?
The long-term trend showed a slight decline for women, but recently there's been an increase in the number of newly widowed people over 60. And tragically, widowed individuals tend to have higher mortality rates themselves compared to married people.
Let's talk finances. Losing a spouse must have a big economic impact.
Huge, especially for women. On average, newly widowed people see an income drop, but for women, that drop averages around 37%. It significantly increases the risk of poverty, particularly for older widows.
Why such a big hit for women?
Often tied to traditional gender roles. Maybe the husband handled the finances. Maybe the wife had lower lifetime earnings due to time out for kids. Lower Social Security benefits. It's sometimes called the widowhood penalty. Many women face real hardship. Housing costs become a huge burden. Debt can be an issue.
And the emotional side. Grief must be overwhelming.
Intense grief, loneliness, sadness are almost universal. There's a much higher risk of depression, anxiety, even PTSD. And social isolation is a major problem losing your primary companion.
Is there really a widowhood effect on the survivor's health?
Yes. Research confirms it. There's an increased risk of death for the surviving spouse, especially right after the loss. One study quantified it as a 48% increase. The stress, the grief, changes in health behaviors, it takes a physical toll. It might be even stronger for men if the wife's death was unexpected.
Do people tend to remarry after being widowed?
Less often than after divorce, generally, especially older people. Men tend to remarry more often and more quickly than women. Though, interestingly, the only age group where remarriage rates have actually increased recently is adults 65 and older.
Really? Why might that be?
Longer, healthier lifespans, maybe? Changing social norms about later life relationships. It's a slight uptick, but noticeable.
So widowhood is this major life event with deep financial and emotional scars, affecting women disproportionately and often overlooked in broader discussions about marriage ending.
Exactly. It deserves just as much attention as divorce, given its prevalence and impact.
Okay, and finally, let's circle back to the impact on children when a marriage ends. Whether it's divorce or widowhood, kids are obviously affected.
Absolutely. For children of divorce, it can be a really tough time. Lots of confusing emotions, sadness, anger, anxiety, maybe feeling abandoned. Younger kids might even blame themselves.
Does it affect their behavior or school?
It can. Some kids withdraw, others might act out more. Academically, concentration can suffer, motivation might dip, leading to lower scores or even lower educational attainment down the road, like lower rates of finishing high school or college, according to some studies.
What about long-term impacts? Mental health, relationships?
There's an increased risk for anxiety and depression, both in childhood and carrying into adulthood. And some research suggests potential difficulties in forming stable relationships later in life. Also, kids from divorced families are more likely to experience poverty.
It sounds pretty bleak. Is it always negative?
No, and that's crucial. The impact isn't uniform at all. Many kids adjust well over time. The key isn't the divorce itself, but the process and the environment after.
So what helps kids cope? What mitigates the negative stuff?
Low parental conflict is probably the single biggest factor. If parents can manage their disagreements away from the kids, it makes a huge difference.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What else?
Quality relationships with both parents, assuming it's safe. Economic stability helps reduce stress. Parents being supportive, communicating well, providing stability and routine. Professional help like counseling can be beneficial too.
And sometimes divorce is actually better for the kids.
Absolutely. If the marriage involved high conflict, abuse, or toxicity, getting out of that environment can be a huge positive for children's well-being.
Does the legal system try to protect kids during divorce?
It does. That best interest of the child standard guides everything. In tough custody battles, courts might appoint a guardian ad litem, kind of an investigator for the court focused on the child, or a child representative who acts more like the child's lawyer.
And parenting plans.
Yes, detailed parenting plans covering schedules, decision-making, communication, finances, those are standard now. The goal is to shield kids from conflict and make sure their needs stay central.
So while divorce is hard on kids, the outcome really depends on how parents handle it and the support systems in place.
Exactly. Minimize conflict, maximize support and stability that gives kids the best chance to thrive.
Okay, one last area.
Yeah.
International marriages. U.S. citizens marrying non-citizens. That seems like a growing trend.
It is, yeah. Globalization, travel, online connections, it's more common. Census data shows a significant percentage of married households involve at least one foreign-born spouse.
And often, the marriage is the pathway to a green card, right?
It's a primary pathway, yes. Family-based immigration is huge. USCIS processes hundreds of thousands of applications based on marriage each year.
Are the motivations always romantic?
Often they are, absolutely. But other factors can play a role too. Economic opportunities for the non-citizen spouse. Immigration benefits are obviously a major factor. Cultural influences, maybe difficulties in the local marriage market.
Which leads to concerns about marriage fraud, right? Marrying just for the green card.
Right. USCIS is very focused on ensuring the marriage is bona fide, genuine, and not just for immigration purposes. There's a whole process to verify that.
What about divorce rates in these marriages? Are they higher or lower?
It's complex. Overall, foreign-born adults in the U.S. actually have lower rates of having ever divorced compared to native-born.
Oh, interesting.
But some specific research found that immigrants who married before getting citizenship and then later naturalized actually had a higher divorce rate than similar immigrants who didn't naturalize.
Suggesting maybe the initial marriage was partly about status?
It could suggest that, yeah,
Yeah.
that compatibility might have taken a backseat to securing legal status initially, leading to higher dissolution later once citizenship was achieved. But other studies just suggest intermarriage generally carries slightly higher risks due to cultural differences. So the data is mixed.
And the legal process for that marriage-based green card is pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. Lots of forms, fees, documentation, marriage certificate, proof you live together, joint bank accounts, photos, interviews. If the marriage is less than 2 years old, you get a conditional green card first. And have to prove again 2 years later the marriage is still real to get conditions removed. They scrutinize things closely.
So international marriages add another layer. Cultural differences, immigration pressures, legal scrutiny, all woven into the relationship dynamic.
Exactly. It's another facet of the diverse landscape of marriage and divorce in the U.S. today.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, that 50% divorce rate, clearly an oversimplification. It gets skewed by repeat marriages, and different metrics tell different stories.
Right. We've seen how divorce rates have actually fallen overall since the 80s, though not for everyone, that divorce divide based on education and the rise of gray divorce.
We journeyed through history, saw how laws like Married Women's Property Acts and no-fault divorce radically changed things, often tied to women's rights.
Looked at the legal nuts and bolts, asset division, custody, the best interest standard, and saw how socioeconomic factors create real regional and demographic patterns.
We unpacked infidelity prevalence, motivations, impact. Consider the often forgotten consequences of widowhood.
Discuss the nuanced effects on children, how parental conflict is key, and touched on the unique aspects of international marriages.
And back to that initial question about the denominator effect. Yes, it seems clear that serial marriages do disproportionately inflate some of the annual divorce statistics we hear.
Absolutely. Those individual events add up in the yearly counts.
So the bottom line is, you really can't understand marriage and divorce with just one number. You have to look at individual lives, societal shifts, legal changes, the whole complex picture.
Which leads to a final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, the economy, technology, changing social norms, how do you think marriage and divorce will continue to evolve? What new challenges or maybe new supports do you see emerging for people navigating these relationships in the future?
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring these really important topics.